Welcome to Unit 13 of the TESOL course at Southern Utah University. This video focuses on the 4 strands of language learning and how they relate to lesson planning. In previous videos we've talked about the 4 strands briefly. In this video we'll describe who pollination is, and then we'll talk about those 4 strands: language-focused learning, meaning-focused input and output, and fluency development. Pollination is a language learning and vocabulary researcher from New Zealand. His focus has been on academic vocabulary and reading, and especially on trying to build a framework to help language learning instructors understand the best ways to help students acquire language. So he published an article several years ago called The 4 Strands of Language Learning. It's been shared widely in the TESOL field, and it's been adapted for many different purposes in language learning and teaching. But these are the 4 strands. So the language-focused learning, that's where we are doing explicit formal instruction, teaching the structures or other features of the language. And then along the bottom there we have the input, the reading and listening, the output, the writing and the speaking, and then we need to practice over and over again to develop that fluency. Let's talk specifically about each one of these strands. So the first one, the language-focused learning, as we mentioned, this is the explicit or formal language instruction, where we're teaching the systems of the language. How does vocabulary, how do phrases work? How does grammar of the language work? What are some cultural aspects of the language that are important? Also teaching the sound system, the pronunciation. As well, this could include things like strategy instruction. Modeling how to use a strategy, telling students why it's useful, and then that would fit under here. When students use dictionaries or flashcards and they're focused on learning the language, not using it, but just learning the language, that's all part of this language-focused learning. Keep in mind that this is just one part of language learning. Some language classrooms, this is all that the teachers do. They just teach the language. The learners never use the language. And that's one of the cautions that Nation gives, is that we need to teach language explicitly, but that's only part of it. The other part is helping learners develop proficiency in using the language. So one of these is meaning-focused input. So this diagram here represents something from Vygotsky, an educational researcher and theorist, and he presented the idea of the zone of proximal development. So the innermost circle, the dark blue there, is what the student already knows. In this case, this is all the language that they already have in the target language. The second circle is what they're ready to learn. In other words, this is the I+1. The outer circle, that light color, is what's beyond what the student can learn at this moment. And so our goal with meaning-focused input is to help students expand from that inner circle to the second circle, what they're ready to begin learning. So their focus is primarily on what they already know, but we can push them out a little bit more to do things that are just above their level, where they're focusing on the meaning. What does this language mean? They're doing useful kind of tasks, but they're not having to focus too heavily on trying to understand and learn all of the language. This is just, they already know most of the language. What they're focusing on here is using the language to do something meaningful. So example activities could be reading a novel at their level. So a graded reader, where we're focusing on the I+1. It's just above what they already know. They could be listening to podcasts or movies, again, that are at their current reading level. Also, oral and written conversations, text or email with a peer. They're getting that input that's at their level, so where they can focus on what is the meaning here, and they're not having to spend all of the time focusing, what does that word mean? What does this structure mean? Okay, so they're using language in useful, meaningful ways. That's meaning-focused input. Meaning-focused output is very similar. Okay, obviously the focus here then is on the writing and the speaking. Again, most of the language is known. And so their focus is on transmitting ideas to others. But one of the really important things about output, and this connects to what we learned about second language acquisition, is that when we do output, we're better at noticing where our gaps are. So we know where we need to improve on. It helps us to test out what we know about the language and make sure that it works. So as we do these meaningful tasks and we practice and we test the language, then we start learning, okay, where are my strengths? Where are my weaknesses? What do I need to focus on in the future in terms of the language so that I can complete the kinds of meaningful tasks that I want to do? So examples of meaning-focused output might be things like keeping a journal, a written journal or an oral journal, some kind of vlog maybe. But also group work is really good for practicing meaning-focused output because there has to be that negotiation, that exchange. And so there's often we'll be speaking or writing. And keep in mind that when a peer is giving their output, then the partner receives it as input. And so group work is really helpful for language acquisition and for building language skills because it's both the input and the output. Fluency development. So this is after we practice meaning-focused input and output, then we need to go back and do those activities over and over and over again to build fluency development. So Nation would say that conditions for something to be considered fluency development is that there can be nothing new. This has to be something that the learner has already done before. The goal here is just to help them do it with greater fluency and greater confidence. So the focus can be on input or output. It can be on reading, listening, or writing and speaking, wherever they need to practice their fluency development. It is helpful when there's some pressure from the teacher. The teacher's saying, okay, here's some conditions or a time limit that you need to do this in. It focuses the learner to really work on the fluency aspect of it. And so there needs to be large amounts of practice, large amounts of language for learners to develop this kind of fluency and confidence. So an example in speech could be speed conversations. I do this quite a bit with my students. I put them in 2 rows. They face a partner. They have some kind of topic they have to discuss with the partner. I give them a time limit. They do it. When they're done, now they switch and they get a new partner and they do the same thing. The first time it's really more meaning-focused input or output. But as we go into the second, the third, or the fourth partner and they're doing the exact same thing, what they're focusing now is really refining their ability to communicate it effectively and efficiently. They're building that fluency development. But it's the same task 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times. And students actually like this because they like the idea of being able to really produce the output much more quickly. I often will reduce the time frame the more they do speed conversations to help them improve their fluency. Another way to do this with reading would be pushed practice. So what happens is that they read something in a time limit, and then you tell them to stop. And however far they got, they put a mark there. Then they go back and they read again, but this time they're trying to read the same thing, but get further through it. And so they're building their reading speed, they're developing fluency. There's no new content, no new language here. This is stuff they already know, essentially. What they're doing is building fluency. Timed writing, asking students to write things in a time period. And it's things that they feel confident, they already know the content for, but they have to get it out into writing more quickly. Or having students summarize something in a certain number of words and then say, okay, now summarize again in fewer words and summarize again in fewer words. They're dealing with the same content but and the same language, but what they're focusing on is their fluency. Repeated listenings is another way to do this. Have someone listen to something more than one time, and each time they're going to understand more, they're going to build their fluency and their understanding. So as we think about these 4 strands, the goal here is that during a learner's experience with a lesson or a content or a unit, that it's fairly balanced, that we don't just focus on one or another. Now in a certain day we may focus on one. This may be a day that we focus just on primarily on language-focused learning or on fluency development. But overall, in the terms of our weeks or the months of the course, we've got a balance here of skills. This here would be an unbalanced course. So the teacher is focusing heavily on language-focused learning with very little opportunities for input, output, and fluency development. This is what we often think of as a traditional language learning classroom, where the teacher is talking a lot and learners are focusing on learning the language, but they're not using it. Here we might have something that we might think of more as a communicative language learning classroom. The teacher is not teaching hardly any language explicitly. Students are just practicing with simple tasks that they already know. They're building great fluency and they're getting some meaning focused input and output, but not much. This is not a balanced classroom. Okay, this kind of classroom here could happen when students are given lots of opportunities to listen and read, and the teacher is teaching a lot, so they're learning lots of new language, but they're not doing any kind of output and there's no fluency development. Okay, what we want is this more balanced classroom like this, that over the course of the term or the session, that students are getting a fairly equal balance in all 4 of the strands. That leads to effective language learning. So in this video we talked about who Paul Nation is and then his 4 strands for language learning.